Welcome to Balancing Parenthood and Me Time. This event is sponsored by PayPal. Are you looking for ways to support your friends, family, or neighbors? PayPal makes it easy to help others who are having a tough time right now. With peer-to-peer payments, you can send money quickly to your loved ones, whether they are nearby or far away. With money pools, you can easily collect funds from many different people to help your community. And with Donate, you can contribute to help support the cause of your choice. Download the PayPal app to start helping today.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jessica Grose, lead editor for parenting at the New York Times, and today we're kicking off our parenting virtual event series. I'm so thrilled to be joined today by Pooja Lakshmin, a board-certified perinatal psychiatrist specializing in women's mental health and a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at George Washington University School of Medicine. Welcome, Pooja.
Hi, Jess. It's so great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you could join us. In the recent piece that you wrote for New York Times Parenting, you argued that parents often give too much of themselves to others while neglecting their own mental health and well-being. The coronavirus quarantine has only exacerbated these issues, as we all know. And today we're going to discuss how parents can shift towards a healthier mindset. To our audience, you could submit questions anytime using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please include your name and town. We like to mention where people are listening from. Please note that today's discussion is being recorded and that the event is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So please reach out to a professional health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. So Pooja, I want to hear from you. What are you noticing among moms and dads in your practice when it comes to martyrdom during the pandemic? Do you find that women in particular are sort of doubling down on their mom guilt, or is it easier for them to realize the expectations put on all of us in this moment where we're trying to possibly work while doing childcare and also educating our kids are just too much and kind of throwing those expectations out the window?
Yeah, well, so it's a little bit of both. I would say definitely in the in light of this worldwide pandemic that we're in and a global crisis that we're in, I think it's easier. It has been easier for my patients and for women that I talk to be able to see that the expectations are ridiculous. Nobody can meet these expectations. Nobody really knows what they're doing. We're all sort of flying by the seat of our pants. So on one hand, it's easy to see that, but it's still really difficult to know that and put that into action. So I'm definitely still seeing a fair amount of anxiety and guilt around how to navigate the fact that you're at home full time with your kids, you're in charge of homeschooling, and you're working full time from home. And like you talked about actually in today's newsletter for parenting, how the mental load of that, how the burden of that still falls on moms. So even though moms know that that's something that the expectations are too high, I think it's still really difficult, especially if you're somebody who is more type A and kind of has perfectionistic tendencies. It's really tough not to internalize that and put those high expectations on yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that I just reported on were how to have conversations about risk and what risks you're comfortable with a partner, or just even figuring it out for yourself. And one thing that struck me in my own life, but also with a lot of our readers, is that absolutely all of the things that we used to do without thinking now require an extra layer of work and negotiation. So the piece that I ran yesterday, one of the couples that I talked to was having an argument about whether their kid could use a public bathroom when out at the park. And normally that's just what is more mundane than going to the bathroom?
Right.
Right? But now that requires an extra layer of negotiation, thought, planning, fear. What sort of tips can you give folks about how to handle just like that extra layer that is of anxiety and negotiation that's kind of on top of everything that we do now, whether as parents or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first piece is to recognize that it's happening, that this is a whole nother layer of mental load that's on us. And our brains, like the way that our brains work is that we want to have a clear answer. We want to know what's right and what's wrong. And in these situations, that's what makes it so hard. There really aren't clear right answers. There's not really medical guidelines that are telling you, like, is it okay, you know, with a new baby to go to the grocery store and get diapers, or all of these different decisions that parents have to make on a daily basis. So one key is just recognizing that you're having to create the wheel yourself, and everybody's doing that. So of course that's hard. So it makes sense that you would be stressed about that and that you would feel fatigued by it as well. The other thing is to recognize that as much as we want there to be right answers, this really is, these decisions are decisions that families need to make on their own. And so much of it comes down to communicating with your partner. And I actually read your piece and I saw that Dr. Sachs talked about this a bit too, in regard to when you're communicating with your partner, really trying to come up with places where you align. You know, like, we want our child to be safe. We want our child's well-being is at the forefront of our mind. And when you're communicating, really looking for spaces that the two of you align. So it doesn't turn into a conflict between the two of you, that you kind of stay on the same team.
Yeah, another quote from her that I just loved was about how the pandemic is a Rorschach test.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does feel like it can bring up, not even just in your relationship, but in general, sort of any baggage that you had, any sort of fears about things that might be totally different, any sort of feelings of control and issues around control. I'm hearing a lot from our readers that, like, you know, there is this feeling of being out of control that they haven't felt since their children were newborns. I've heard tons of people make that comparison between that sort of like newborn, just learning to be a parent feeling, and what we're going through now. And so are there sort of any things that folks can do to, we can't get control of the situation, but just sort of feel like they can manage that lack of control, lack of certainty that we all have right now?
Yeah, so I'm always a big fan of making lists and getting things out onto paper, because I feel like that, you know, gets things out of the churn of my mind and helps me see it in front of me. So with all of these things, when there's different decisions to make, I think it's really helpful even to have like a whiteboard or a big piece of paper that you sit down with your partner and look at, like, here are the decisions in front of us. These are the things that we need to think about over the next week. And it really does feel like every week there's another decision that needs to be made. Yeah. So kind of looking at this as an ongoing process as opposed to like a one and done. And when you're making these decisions, one of the things as a perinatal psychiatrist, one of the frameworks that I use is called a risk framework, as opposed to risk benefit. So you're kind of looking at, well, what are the risks of, you know, letting my kid use the public porta potty in the park versus what are the risks of not letting him use it? Right. And if we don't let him use it, then what's the alternative? Or is this something that has a timeline? Like if we don't feel safe with our kid going back to daycare yet, what about in August? What about in September? So having it, not feeling like these decisions are black and white, but more time limited, I think that helps to take down some of the pressure that goes with each decision.
Absolutely. And I that's actually something I've said to my husband about a million times, is like, I can't think more than a week ahead, because for me particularly, September is like a real sore spot. Like I really want our kids to be able to go back to school safely. They're missing school so badly. I will be heartbroken for them if they cannot go back, and there just aren't answers yet. And there won't be answers until there are answers. And so like, I find myself sort of getting stuck in a mental cul-de-sac where I'm like, well, what if this happens, then we should do this. And if that happens, then we should do that. And it's just like pointless wheel spinning. So I think that advice to sort of just keep it a week at a time. That's all we can manage. Right?
And one of the other things I think I mentioned to you in the past was this concept of worry time.
Yes, I love
Yes, and I love using that too. So it's like you give yourself 20 minutes every day where you're allowed to worry about all these things that are completely out of your control, and you know that there's no solutions for yet. But in that 20-minute time period, your brain can just go wild. But if those worries come come up outside of those 20 minutes, you have to save them for the next day. And you can even keep a little notebook or something like that. And I think that that's helpful because it contains the anxiety, so it doesn't just feel as amorphous and floating around with you all the time.
Yep. And that actually is a great segue. So the next question, because that was in a piece that I wrote about what self-care means for parents during this moment, and sort of, that was one way you gave to sort of do self-care, is time boxing the worries. But, I was finding, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I had sick family members. I didn't have any help. My husband and I were both trying to do our jobs. It just all felt like too much. And I was trying to stay very cheerful for my kids. And so the ways that I found self-care were doing things like eating a cookie alone in the bathroom, crying in the way to the grocery store. What else did I do? Oh, I bought a season of Below Deck and watched it while folding laundry. And I know all these things sound sort of like silly and not actually that, not like getting a massage or like all the things that we used to do before the pandemic, but they actually help me quite a bit. So how do parents find, those little moments when we feel like we have no time, and that it might even feel like it's an extra burden on us to have to worry about self-care in this moment, where it's like, oh, great, another thing to do that in this day that is overfull in the first place.
Right. It kind of adds to the mental load, or it's another responsibility that we feel like we're failing at. Absolutely. I talked to a mom a week or two ago who just had a baby, who, has an infant that's a couple weeks old and has a toddler at home, and is working full time. And, her husband's a physician. And she was asking me this question, like, how do I do self-care? What do I do? I feel so guilty. And it's sort of like, in that situation, self-care for you means going to the bathroom when you have to pee. It means, eating a full lunch in the same sitting, right? So I think especially for parents of young children, self-care right now is just really getting down to like the nitty-gritty basics, like these micro decisions that you can make to get some time and some space for yourself. And then even for parents of kids that are a little bit older, where you're doing the homeschooling and you're working from home and all these different things, the way that I'm thinking about self-care is that it's physical space and it's transition time. So all of the examples that you described, Jess, like eating the cookie in the bathroom by yourself, like it's like you just need some space for yourself. And I think that that's really tough if you live in a city. If you're in an apartment, I live in DC, so I'm in this tiny apartment, and it's tough because there's not spaces to go as if you're in a house and, one person can be in their own room, or especially if you don't have access to outdoor space, that makes it really difficult. So what I've been suggesting is that folks really try and divvy up parts of the house or parts of the apartment where, this is your chair, this is the couch where we do these things, or we read our books, and this is the office where I'm working, and really kind of try and keep those separations distinct, because otherwise everything sort of bleeds together. And then the other thing too is the transition time, which we've lost. So we don't have drives to work anymore. We don't have the subway rides that we used to have. So that might mean that at the end of your workday, having a conversation with your partner where you divide up, one person gets to go for a walk at the end of the day, and you switch off, having that alone time, having the time to kind of go from one activity to the next as much as possible, I think is really helpful.
Something that one of our readers brought up that I loved was that she and her spouse created like a fancy cocktail hour with their kids, and they made little finger food, and like they made really nice cocktails for the grown-ups and soft drinks or juice for the kids, and just like made something that was just a period of dead time, sort of like after school and work but before dinner, into kind of a nice ritual. And it's certainly not the same as like any alone time, which like I have had fantasies of like I would literally pay someone $10,000 for like, because it's just it is hard to sort of have just nonstop things to do, but I think sort of trying to get the most joy out of the moments that you are spending with your family that you might not have gotten otherwise, which is not to say that it's also not, you know, you don't have your down moments too, and that it's not hard a lot of the time. But I've definitely found just like trying to focus on the joy of like, I get to sit down and have lunch with my kids in the middle of the day. And that's like actually when they're not having meltdowns, it's really nice. And I like to get to see them and I like to see what they're working on. So, you know, I think trying to reframe those moments instead of thinking drudgery, having some ritual that makes them a little bit more joyful was another sort of great idea I love from one of our readers.
Right. I have a patient that was telling me about her and her kids are doing the New York Times crossword puzzle over the course of a week together. And, you know, they have it at the kitchen table and, you know, as they get to it, they kind of do it together. So all these different activities that, you know, you just didn't really get time to do in the past because you weren't really in the same space during the day can be really nice.
And, you know, we were talking about your friend who's a brand new parent and that, you know, they have a toddler, but like having a newborn or becoming a first-time parent is such a shock to the system, even in the best of circumstances. So do you have particular advice for folks who are first-time parents and navigating, you know, this, again, huge stressor at the same time as navigating the stress of this huge life and identity change that they may be going through?
Yeah. So I think, you know, one of the things that I'm really seeing in my patients is grief around the loss of what they expected their pregnancy to be like and what they expected their postpartum period to be like. You know, pregnancy is a time of such, and parenthood for dads too, for fathers too, it's a time of huge identity change, right? And because of social distancing, you're just not getting the connections that you used to have, those social connections and those opportunities to, you know, like run into a friend at a grocery store and tell them, hey, I'm pregnant. And even just try on the identity as a mother of kind of saying for the first time that I'm pregnant and sharing that news, as well as kind of, you know, not being able to have your partner there for ultrasound visits or, you know, for the gender reveal or baby showers, right? So there's just so much loss, I think, with this. And so it's important to recognize that the grief is normal, that it's okay to feel a little bit betrayed or robbed of this time period. And making space for some of those feelings, I think, is really helpful during this time. The other piece is keeping those connections, even if you can't see folks in person, but making sure that you're staying in touch with family virtually is really, because in that postpartum period, social support is something that we know is so protective in terms of postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. And so I think finding creative ways to stay connected, whether that's here in DC, we have a bunch of online moms groups that have sprung up. So those types of things can be really helpful as well. And I think just recognizing that this is a tough time. And so being gentle with yourself, making sure that you're staying connected with other folks, new parents, sleep is something that is hard to come by, but is definitely helpful if you can find a way to navigate, if you do have a partner, if you can, you know, set up shifts or things like that. And this is a place too where in some sense, if you're a new parent, you don't have anything to compare it to, right? So if your first experience of parenthood is in the pandemic, obviously you're having a very different experience. I am seeing in my patients that this is, you know, their second kid or their third kid. There's in some sense even more of a feeling of loss because you know a lot more of what's missing.
Right. Oh,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's, you know, hearing you talk, it's also a good reminder if you are not the person who's a new parent, but if you have friends who are newly welcoming babies into their life, maybe check in with them more than you would in normal times. Like regularly, you can set yourself a calendar note to just, you know, make sure they're doing okay. You know, I have all of these mom chats going with like different groups of friends. And even though, you know, none of us have new babies, they have been a lifeline for me during this time. So I think, you know, the role of friends and relatives in this moment, like that's one way to just, you know, say hi, see how they're doing in a low key way. Don't expect a response, but just having them know that you're there might be particularly helpful right now. And then sort of the last question, two more questions. So one, if, you know, you are afraid that a friend or a family member during this time is struggling in a way that feels clinically significant and beyond just that sort of very normal grief that a lot of people are feeling right now about the loss of their daily, their normal daily lives and the massive changes. How do you go about encouraging them to get help? What are signs that they may need help beyond just, the normal support that friends and family can give?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, because we're really, I think as the research comes out and as we have more data coming out, we're really going to see that the mental health effects of the pandemic itself and then the social distancing precautions that are put in place have really been having significant mental health effects for parents. I have a piece out today actually about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders in particular. So the two pieces that are the most important are, is this something that's affecting your functioning? And then how long has it been going on? So one of the most common signs of clinical depression is this feeling of like hopelessness or sadness or even like a meaninglessness that is there with you all the time. And if it's there for 2 weeks or longer, that could be a sign that there's something actually clinical going on. With depression, we also see changes in sleep. So not sleeping enough, not being able to sleep, or sleeping too much, changes in appetite, eating too much or not having an appetite, concentration changes. So all of those things combined, and then also not being able to function in the way that you typically are able to function. You're not able to get out of bed, you're missing work, you aren't able to engage with your kids because you feel so badly. And then in particular right now with anxiety, if you're somebody who's having a lot of obsessions and compulsions around contamination or, fears of the virus, that's definitely also a place where it could be something clinical if it's affecting your functioning. Finally, the other piece too that people often don't recognize is that anxiety and mood issues can show up as irritability and anger. So if you're finding yourself, really losing your temper with your kids, and that's something that's kind of going on, there's a pattern of that and it's lasting for a consistent period of time, that could also be a sign that you might need professional help as well.
And just before we start getting to reader questions, because, so much of what we've discussed has been sort of serious and sad. What's one positive or fun thing that's happened to you in the past couple of months since we've been in all of our quarantine?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am not somebody who would ever call myself a baker, but I have taken up baking from scratch and made some lovely biscuits and chocolate cake, and turns out I'm pretty good at it. Who knew? Nice. So that's been a fun little activity for me. How about you?
For us, we've discovered that our kids like hiking. I always love, I love hiking outside. I will not camp. I joke that it's like in our marriage vows that I don't sleep outside. But I really love day hikes. And since obviously everything is closed, hiking is just a really great activity for the kids to get into, that if, we were having our typical New York City summer, we wouldn't have, been ambitious and tried to drive and get out and do these hikes. And, the first ones, I will not say were hugely successful, but as we keep doing them with our 3 and 7-year-old, they're really starting to love them. And like we had one where nobody whined at all. Like we're good for snacks and how to kind of like manage their energy level so that it's the best experience for everyone. But that's been a real joy for all of us.
I love that.
And I am excited to get to some reader questions.
Awesome.
So this is a really great one. Suggestions. J. Rowe is asking if we have suggestions for single parents who don't have a partner to watch kids when they go out for a walk or take a shower. I'll start with that. So we had a really beautiful essay from Tanzina Vega, who just had a baby. She used to work at the Times and now works at NPR. And she has been using virtual calls a lot to get help because obviously people can't see her and her new baby. And so, having a friend sing a lullaby, even for a baby, like that can can be helpful, and having people drop things off for you, like sort of getting creative about what help looks like, for having no contact. So if it saves you time and gives you extra space to have a friend go grocery shopping for you or do sort of that kind of favor, she found also that was like incredibly helpful. And I would love to hear your suggestions.
Yeah, well, I was going to suggest the same thing in terms of really looking at if there's neighbors or people in your community that you could lean on for help with groceries or for doing, chores outside the house or things like that, where you can sort of expand your network and see if there's other folks that live close to you that might be able to provide some support. I love the idea of doing, the Skype stories and like the virtual singing and things like that for babies. I think you have to get creative, and it's tough. It's hard. None of this is to say that this is easy.
And I think the stresses on single parents are even worse because it's like you don't get a break.
Yeah.
Ever. And so, so empathetic to the struggles of that. I mean, the other thing I would say is, if you can get the kids to sleep earlier, then, I'm every day, this is a struggle to be like, please go to sleep at your normal time. So and then taking like half an hour to yourself to take a bath or just whatever, watch a dumb TV show, have a period where like you just are trying to turn your brain off, where you don't have anything else to do, while still trying to make sure you're getting your sleep. That's also, that's something that I do.
And I guess the other thing that I would add too is that, I have patients who have had to make the decision to fly family in, or, so much of this is a risk analysis. So it really if the toll on your mental health is really significant, if there are people that can help and if they can, self-quarantine beforehand, and if there's a way that they could come and be helpful, and minimize some risks, that's always something to consider too.
Lauren, Lana from New York asks, how do you get a partner who is not contributing so much to do more and share the load? So, one thing, I find that often these conversations get very emotional when you want them to actually be factual. And so writing down all of the responsibilities that you are taking on and just having them, like, even just take one day, one weekday and list everything that you're doing. I think in a lot, if your partner is well-meaning, I think often, and I feel like we've talked in this discussion already about invisible labor, I think often they're not seeing everything that you're doing. And so in their minds, they think that they're pulling equal weight, but in fact, when you put it out on a list, they are not. And Claire Kane Miller, our colleague who writes for Upshot, had a great headline that was like 50% of dads think that they're doing their fair share of homeschooling and only 3% of moms agree, I believe was the headline. And so, you just need to have a real factual talk about all of the responsibilities that you now have, and being clear about the fact that, like, we all have way more responsibilities at home than we did 3 months ago. Like, it is a crazy and unreasonable amount of things that we all have to do. So I think very emotionlessly, like, making the list of all the things and then having a discussion about what would feel equitable.
Yeah, and I love that idea, Jess. And the other thing that I would add is really looking at if you have any role in their reluctance to help out in the house. So is there any pattern of when they do try and help out, do you criticize them? Or do you say, hey, that's not how I would have done it? Like, is there some gatekeeping that's going on? And where can you modify your own behavior so that they feel more accepted and they feel like helping in the house leads to good things happening for them or to them feeling good? Especially if you're somebody who struggles with anxiety, there's a way that letting go of that control in terms of household chores and taking care of children can be another area where you end up being where it's hard to be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer from Detroit asks, what if our partner seems not to need the self-care we do? How do we have these conversations without feeling guilty?
Yeah. So one of the things that I often talk about is that guilt is something that all women feel. That it's sort of a homeostasis type of emotion. It's a place that your brain goes, but just because you feel guilty doesn't mean that you're making the wrong choice. So you can feel guilty and you can still make choices that are in line with your own self-care. So I think, you have to stop looking at guilt as a moral compass and think of it more as this is a background emotion. I know that I'm going to be someone who, maybe I'm a people pleaser. Maybe it's hard for me to make decisions for myself. So guilt is probably going to be there, but I can still take these actions. I guess it's a little bit of a different story if you feel like your partner is not supportive in you taking on self-care or in you setting boundaries. And that would be a conversation. I think that would be a little bit of a different conversation.
I totally empathize with this question because I need a lot more sleep than my partner does. And so, I like any opportunity to take a nap, I will take a nap. And so I was feeling guilty about that not being equal because he doesn't like naps, he doesn't take naps. And, I, had the real conversation with him about it. And he was like, "You're so unpleasant when you don't nap, that it's also self-care for me." If you're exhausted, no one is happy. So that's all to think about. So Krista's asking a question that is, I think a lot of people are feeling. I definitely am feeling it. Is there anything we can do to help our interactions with kids during the quote unquote work day? I hate feeling like I'm pushing them off constantly, but also can't stop to play with them. So, I mean, I really feel you. I think as much as you can, and I don't know how old your kids are because it's sort of hard for the younger ones to understand, but like if there are actual symbols that you can put, whether it's like the closed door or a red sign that says stop and a green sign that says go, and so that they have visual cues about when they can interrupt you and when they can't, and when you really need to have that sort of work time. Another thing that I found has worked in terms of like kind of keeping boundaries around when, I really can't be interrupted, is a timer. My kids, like for some reason, listening to a timer is much easier than like listening to me when I say like, I really can't deal with you right now. So having like, 30-minute window where it's like, okay, after the timer comes off, I will come play with you. That sort of concrete thing, whether it's visual or mental, having the timer being like, I can't interrupt myself right now, but I'm gonna set this timer, and when it goes off, we can play together. Those are just two things that have helped a little, but I still, get interrupted and get short with my kids when they interrupt me, and it doesn't feel great, but, this is a really non-ideal situation for all of us. Pooja, did you?
Yeah, I saw something on Twitter last night, a woman who, I think she has 3 kids, and she made a graph for over the course of the week how many times she heard one of her kids call mom, and it was literally 75 times a day.
Oh my God, that's so horrible.
So like this is the condition that a lot of folks are living in, right? So you're gonna have to be, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to have to be in that situation, but I like your suggestions. I would also say that instead of saying no or saying that I can't, like kind of redirecting to, I'll be able to sit down with you at 5 p.m. or, once I can sit down with you, we're going to do X, Y, Z. So kind of giving them something to look forward to and having it be something specific also can be helpful as well.
We have 10 minutes left, just so you all know. Allison is asking a question that's on lots of people's minds as well. Can we discuss recommendations around when it's safe and reasonable to take on a summer nanny? So we ran a piece about when childcare can resume, and there's just a lot of factors going into it. At the end of the day, it is a personal decision, and obviously check your state and local laws around what is, legally acceptable to do in terms of shutdown orders and quarantines. But sort of the big 3 things are health, your health and your caretaker's health, your appetite for risk, and where you live. So in terms of health, do you have chronic conditions that make you more susceptible to intense cases of COVID-19, or does your caretaker? So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is your appetite for risk. So, are you and your spouse comfortable with it? What kinds of risk, you need to have a real conversation with a potential caretaker about what's their behavior outside of work. It's not going to be comfortable. And at the end of the day, you need to be comfortable with the fact that you can't control what they do when they're not with you. So think about that in the kind of person that you're hiring and your history with them, how well you know them. So that's another thing. And then where you live, are you in an area that has a spiking number of cases? Are you in a very rural area that wasn't very hard hit at all? Those are sort of some things to think about as you make your decision. But another thing to really not discount, which I think, a lot of folks are discounting now, is also balancing your mental health and the mental health of your children. Because it's not just about the risks of illness from the virus, which obviously are huge and not to be belittled or not discounted in any way. It's incredibly serious, but your mental health and coping when you and your partner may have jobs that you're worried about losing, your kids need another adult or figure to sort of help out. I think that is something that goes into your consideration of risks. Just exactly as Pooja was mentioning, the risk framework is a really good one. But yeah, I'm going to find the exact title of the piece so we can share a link.
Yeah, and that was a great summary, Jess. The only thing that I would add to that is recognizing that you really can't compare yourself to your friends your family in these decisions. It really needs to be specific to your situation, and it's going to look different for everybody. So
the piece is called "When Can Childcare Resume?" I am just going to put it in the chat right now. Nope, I'm going to type the answer. There you go. All right, let's see. Sylvia from Boston's asking, my husband is a frontline worker, so I'm juggling all the home responsibilities, and yet I feel like nothing I'm doing compares to the stress of his role. How can I navigate the strain in our relationships and the feelings of resentment and guilt I cycle through? And how can I communicate better to my employer that the situation is untenable professionally without feeling like I'm doing enough?
So that's a really tough situation, and I think that a lot of partners of folks that are frontline healthcare workers are dealing with this too, of wanting to be supportive, but also being the ones to man kind of everything that's going on at home. And you didn't mention this, but also the stress and anxiety that comes with worrying about the risks of exposure to your family as well. The place that I would start is really talking to your partner and finding out how he's feeling about this, getting some of these like this guilt that you're describing, and maybe some of those messy feelings that you're describing, setting aside a time to really sit down and talk about it. The best way to have those difficult conversations is not, during a time of stress or an argument or, during dinner, but to kind of set aside a time, say this weekend, can we just take an hour to sit down and chat? I just want to really connect with you. I want to touch base and just sort of take a thermometer check of how we're both doing, framing it as we're both a team and I want us to be on the same team, but I also want to make sure that we're both getting our needs met. So coming to the conversation from a place of curiosity, wanting to understand what is his experience and how is he feeling about it. So in these types of conversations, usually the first conversation is kind of a lead-in, where the goal of the first conversation is to get to the second conversation. So as opposed to having kind of a specific agenda about sharing your stress, the best way to go about it might to be curious about what he's feeling and how things are feeling for him in terms of the household.
And in terms of the work part of it, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the kind of relationship you have with your direct manager. If you have a good relationship with your direct manager and you trust them and you think that they will be human beings about, you know, the strain that you're under, and I can't imagine that you do not have fellow coworkers who are under similar strain right now. I think it is worth having a conversation just about, you know, about what your days look like, and frame it, you know, and this has been sort of the advice that we've gotten from workplace experts, you know, frame it as a way as you want to keep doing your job to the best of your abilities. And is there a way that you maybe could have a more flexible schedule is one way to sort of ask for something that would help you do your job the best way that you can do it. So always frame it in a way where it's like, you want to do the best for your company as you can, but also acknowledging that this is an incredibly stressful time, basically for anyone who has caretaking responsibilities, not just for small children, but also for older family members. It's really hard right now. And so I think most employers should not be surprised by any conversation initiated by an employee at this point. You know, so many of us are living this way. So, you know, again, make sure that you are starting from a place of wanting to do your job the best you can. But hopefully if you have a good manager, they can have that conversation with you. And we have time for one more, which a listener from NYC is asking, have you noticed kids are regressing or becoming more needy at this time, maybe because of stress or because they see their parents and expect them to be available? How do you suggest managing expectations with slightly older kids? So I am living through this myself. I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. My 7-year-old is definitely, I wouldn't say she's regressing, but she's having a lot of big feelings. And one thing that is important, I don't actually think it's regression. I think that they're just reacting really normally to their entire lives being upended. And so just think of how hard this time has been on you as an adult who has adult coping mechanisms. So, you know, I think the first move is just understanding that this is a really hard time for them, and them having sort of more big feelings, for lack of a better way to say it, is very normal, and it's a typical response. I hate giving this advice, but it's true. I think routine and structure, as much as you can possibly have it, is really helpful for slightly older kids in terms of expectation setting and just having them feel a little bit safer, even though the structures that used to run their lives are now, you know, just fallen away from school or camp or whatever. You know, I can't say that I run a perfectly scheduled household and that things are not completely destroyed, but at least starting out each day with at least trying to have, you know, this is when we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner and sleep time, and trying to make it as predictable as possible, knowing that we're all under a lot of stress and strain right now. Pooja, do you have anything to add on this last one?
No, I think those are the most helpful pieces. And then I think the only thing I would add is that that it is important to recognize that if they're really acting out, if there's been changes in sleep, if there are other concerning behaviors, that you can always seek professional help too, if this is something that has been ongoing and you're really worried about it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Pooja, and thank you to everyone listening at home. This conversation is part of a slate of digital events the Times is producing to help readers navigate the world we find ourselves in. Next up in our parenting series is a discussion with Tara Parker Pope, the founding editor of Well, and New York University pediatrician Dr. Perry Klass, for tips to help parents manage daily life during the coronavirus crisis. To find out more about our full slate of digital events, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. So that's timesevents.nytimes.com. Finally, we want to give a special thank you to all of our subscribers. You make our work possible. We cannot thank you enough. And we look forward to speaking with you again. Have a great rest of your week, Pooja. And everyone should read Pooja's piece that is up today, which is about experts being concerned about a future spike in postpartum mood disorders and anxiety. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great to connect with everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.